turning our eye to geopolitics, you mentioned Russia. There's been discussions between Washington and Moscow this past week having to do with Ukraine and probably also about Kazakhstan. In regards to these talks, what can you tell us about them and specifically in regards to Ukraine?
Well, what I can say is that Washington is clearly trying to push Russia as much as it can into a war in Ukraine. I mean, that's the only logical conclusion you can get from looking at US policy, which has just been stonewalling at every level, increasing the tension, increasing the tension, increasing the tension, and trying to make it explode and then blaming Russia. And today is January 14th. CNN just published this incredibly ridiculous story that they have this confidential intelligence, which is clearly just coming from the CIA, which, you know, CNN is just the CIA noise network. They have all of these so-called journalists who are just stenographers for the Pentagon and the CIA. They just repeat whatever the CIA and the Pentagon want said. And they say they have this confidential intelligence that Russia is planning a false flag operation and that Russia is going to invade eastern Ukraine. Well, if you're saying that, that means that the US is planning some kind of operation to draw in Russia to eastern Ukraine, because Russia has made it very clear again and again and again that it is not going to invade Ukraine. We've seen this story again and again. I mean, it reminds me of Bounty Gate, where there are all these stories in the US media that Russia was supposedly paying bounties to the Taliban to kill US troops, as if the Taliban needed Russian money to be motivated to kill the soldiers that were occupying its country for 20 years. Okay. But anyway, that story that was published right at an opportune moment that was used to get the House to vote on legislation to block US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, which delayed the inevitable withdrawal by several months. And like Cheney was one of the main forces behind that, Liz Cheney. So now here we are, and we see the same kind of thing where you see these bogus stories selectively leaked by US intelligence agencies to push their interests. It's clear that they're goading Russia in every single way to intervene in Ukraine. And I mean, you just look at all the comments from the Biden administration. You see that they refuse to rule out NATO expansion. We saw that the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, basically just said openly that Ukraine is going to join NATO. Georgia is going to join NATO. These are two countries that were part of the Soviet Union. They're right next to Russia on Russia's borders. So this is the head of NATO saying that we are going to continue to militarily encircle you. You already have Poland, a NATO member, on your border. We're going to add Ukraine. We're going to add Georgia. We're going to surround you with military bases and eventually wage war on you. And Russia got to the point where it said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We're going to demand that NATO not expand anymore. And then that demand by Russia is being portrayed as the Kremlin is being so militaristic and so aggressive and so belligerent by saying that we have a red line. You can't just send a bunch of US troops and US military equipment onto our border in multiple countries and then prepare a war against us. Again, I mean, it's cliche to say this, but imagine imagine Russia had thousands of troops in Mexico, right on the southern US border. And then they did the same thing in Canada. Russia surrounded the US on it. I mean, they only have two land borders, so it's a very difficult situation, very different situation. But imagine Russia had soldiers in both Mexico and Canada, right in the US borders, and continued to send them military equipment. We can just have this new story that clearly came from the CIA stenographers over at Yahoo News, admitting that the CIA since 2014 has been training Ukrainian paramilitaries, which probably means Nazis, by the way, when they're talking about Ukrainian paramilitaries, these far-right white supremacist ultranationalists. They've been training them to, in the words of a former CIA director, quote, kill Russians. And he said that the US is training a, quote, insurgency in Ukraine. So, I mean, at every single stage, the US government, and this is bipartisan policy, has been pushing for a war with Russia. And Russia's gotten to the point where they say, out of basic self-respect, you cannot continue to do this. We're not going to tolerate it. And then now all the media says Russia is the evil aggressor, Russian imperialism, blah, blah, blah. So then Biden and Putin have a talk. And Biden, who interestingly, I mean, this guy can barely give a speech without talking about his blonde leg hairs because he's so, at this point, just his mental health is so bad. He's in such a bad state. But Biden, interestingly, it looks like when he came into office, he recognized how bad the tensions were with Russia, and he clearly tried to pursue a more conciliatory stance with Russia. He tried to pursue diplomacy with Russia, although he, like Trump, surrounded himself with a bunch of neocon fanatics like Victoria Nuland, the architect of the 2014 coup in Ukraine, which started all of this conflict. Before 2014, they didn't have this conflict. It was the U.S. coup
if I could just stop you
orchestrated
there,
by the Obama administration that got us to this point. Well, anyway, quickly, I just want to say that clearly Biden was trying to pursue some kind of diplomacy, and there was a recent virtual summit between Putin and Biden agreed to have these talks in Geneva that began in January 10th, and they went nowhere because Wendy Sherman was sent, this not even that high level State Department official who's just a total neocon. She's an ally of Victoria Nuland. They sent her, and Russia sent Ryabkov, who is a major official, kind of an undersecretary of state, their equivalent, and he refused to concede these basic security demands, and the U.S. refused to concede anything. So they didn't agree to anything. Russia has demanded that the U.S. send a written statement of its official policy, which the U.S. might not even do. I mean, at every level, the U.S. has refused to concede anything, refused to engage in diplomacy. Biden said he wanted to have these talks, even though he knew that they would go nowhere. And now we're at the point where the U.S. continues to send weapons to Ukraine, continues to boast of training Ukrainian paramilitaries in an insurgency. And if Russia does anything, now Russia's portrayed as the aggressor.
And that's something Trump was also doing, even though he was a Russian puppet sending weapons to Ukraine. But just to take a step back, I always found this the last 10 years or so of tensions that we've had with Russia very odd because, when I was a kid in the 90s, Bill Clinton was palling around with Boris Yeltsin. George W. Bush seemed to get along well with Putin. And then again, like it seemed like around the time of what happened in Ukraine, there was this breaking point where again, they're the evil empire. So could you just give us some context on what you think happened and how Russia became the bad guys again? Was it having to do with the Arab Spring and Russia's involvement in Libya and Syria that led up to Ukraine, or just what's your perspective on that?
Ukraine was the moment at which Russia said it's not going to tolerate this aggression by the U.S. anymore. Another country right on Russia's border, a former republic of the Soviet Union, a country with a very large Russian minority and Russian ethnic minority, especially in the East. These are people who identify as ethnic Russians. They identify more with Russia than with Ukraine. And they've been there. I mean, they're not like settlers. They've been there for many generations, but the Ukrainian government, not only since the 2014 US-backed coup orchestrated by the Obama administration and these neoconservatives like Victoria Nuland, by the way, the wife of Robert Kagan, one of the most notorious neoconservatives in Washington, one of the original founding members of the Project for a New American Century, one of the architects of the Iraq War. So these are the people that the Biden administration brought back into the State Department and overseeing Russia policy, these hardcore neocons who they want to balkanize Russia. They want to break up Russia. And the coup in Ukraine was part of their strategy to surround Russia with NATO member states and US troops, and eventually to wage war and piece by piece break up the Russian Federation. They tried that in two different wars in Chechnya, in which the US supported Chechen separatists, including, I want to remind people who later became commanders of ISIS, including one of the most infamous figures named Omar al-Shashani. Omar al-Shashani, which in Arabic, al-Shashani means the Chechen. Omar the Chechen was trained by the US military when he was fighting with Georgia against Russia, another country that had a color revolution backed by NATO. So, I mean, the U.S. has this long history of supporting these jihadis in republics of Russia, of the Russian Federation, like Chechnya. Chechnya is not a former Soviet republic. Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation. And we've seen this constant policy of trying to balkanize Russia, just as we see the policy now of trying to break up China with Hong Kong, with Taiwan. with Tibet, which goes back many decades, and now with Xinjiang in the Western province with the Uyghurs and supporting the Turkestan Islamic Party, and which is now they're allied with ISIS, and we're working with Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Like, these are the forces that the US has been supporting against China and against Russia. And in 2014, Russia said, we're not going to tolerate it anymore. And from 1991 until, well, even before, really from like 1989, 1990 until 2014, really, Russia, for the most part, went along with Western foreign policy. Let's not forget, I mean, you mentioned Libya. In 2011, actually, Putin was not president. It was Medvedev. But Russia and China, this is before the rise of Xi Jinping as a significant independent force in Chinese politics. Medvedev and Russia and China in 2011 at the UN Security Council, they did not veto the call for NATO intervention in Libya. They abstained on that vote. And I think that was a major turning point when Russia and China, which at that moment, they had governments that were not necessarily super friendly to the West, but they weren't necessarily antagonistic. So what happens is after the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, China takes this ultra-left position that the Soviet so-called social imperialism is supposedly a bigger threat than capitalist imperialism. This leads to Kissinger taking his famous secret trip to China in 1971. And then Nixon takes his famous public trip to China in 1972. China effectively allies with US imperialism against the Soviet Union. They work together and they basically overthrow the Soviet Union. And then China in the 1990s continues to have a policy that is somewhat friendly to the US, although the US NATO bombs China's embassy in Yugoslavia, which was a clear sign that the US would not tolerate any independent Chinese foreign policy. And then you have Boris Yeltsin, the alcoholic neoliberal US puppet in Russia, who just goes along with US-Russia, NATO expansion, all of this. And by the 2000s, finally, Russia and China begin to have a more independent foreign policy very slowly. And then by 2011, that was the moment at which they said, all right, this is not going to happen anymore. We're not going to continue to allow all of these regime change wars. And then in 2014, you have the color revolution back, the coup backed by the US in Ukraine. Russia says, we're done. No more color revolutions on our borders. And then China continues to face this problem with these Uyghur separatists backed by the US. The NED has spent millions of dollars funding these Uyghur separatist groups. And finally, that was the red line. And Russia intervenes in Crimea, annexes Crimea in a popular referendum that the majority of people in Crimea supported, because these are ethnic Russians for the most part. I mean, Crimea was just given over to the Ukrainian SSR when it was part of the Soviet Union. It didn't mean anything. So the point is that 2011, the NATO war that destroyed Libya, still today, by the way, there is no central government in Libya. They were supposed to have an election recently, which was delayed because it's a total failed state. And 2014, the US-backed coup in Ukraine, those were the moments where China and Russia said they're not going to tolerate this anymore. You have the rise of Xi Jinping, who in 2013 declares the creation of the New Silk Road in Kazakhstan, by the way. And then in 2014, you have the coup in Ukraine. Then you have another attempted coup on Russia's border in Belarus in 2020. It fails. And that's another moment where Russia says, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. Russia and Belarus ally to prevent a coup in Belarus. And then now you have this in Kazakhstan, which not only affects Russia, but it also has a massive border with China. And Russia sent in troops through the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And Russia and China have both said in response to this color revolution attempt, clearly backed by the US, Britain, and Turkey, another NATO member in Kazakhstan, both Moscow and Beijing have said very clearly, no more color revolutions. We're done with these regime change operations. Kazakhstan is the end. Belarus is the end. Ukraine is the end. No more. So that's the shift that we've seen, is that Putin, when he came into office, he was Yeltsin's right-hand man. He came in trying to have better relations with the West.
And I just want to interrupt. He actually never would have even probably come to power if the US hadn't interfered in the 96 Russian election, where the communists probably would have beaten Putin if it had not been for the US.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you want to really go far back, the communists attempted a coup against the attempt to restore capitalism. And the US, of course, supported Yeltsin as they bombed the parliament to prevent the communists from retaking control. So if you want to really go back further, I mean, Yeltsin was a total puppet. He had zero legitimacy. And Putin was supposed to be a less alcoholic, more competent statesman to usher Russia into the new world of capitalism and integration with the West. And Putin tried for many years to integrate Russia into the West, and the West refused. NATO refused. And Putin, as a nationalist, he's certainly not a socialist in any way, but he recognized that after so many years of the wars in Chechnya, the color revolutions in Georgia and Poland, and Poland joining NATO, the Baltic states joining NATO and the European Union, Putin just more and more realized that as much as he tried, NATO and the US and Brussels would never allow Russia to integrate with them. Russia will always be the boogeyman. They will never tolerate an independent Russia. And he was forced, not out of any ideology, but of the reality of geopolitics, of material reality, Putin was forced to ironically take a foreign policy that is quite similar to the Soviet Union's foreign policy, even though he doesn't share the Soviet ideology in any way. So this has forced Russia, because the US has refused to allow Russia to have allies, refused to allow Russia to have an independent foreign policy. It has forced Russia to ally with countries that the US refuses to have relations with, like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like these countries that, like Iran, that are targeted, in Belarus, that are targeted by the US for regime change. And now that NATO has continued these regime change operations and color revolutions right on Russia's border, it's saying that it's not going to tolerate it anymore. And instead of taking a defensive foreign policy, it's now going on the offensive. And China's doing the same thing. It's a few years behind Russia, but what we've seen with China's policy on Taiwan, China's policy on Hong Kong, they have said that they refuse to just sit there as the US and NATO and the European Union continue to try to overthrow every single ally of theirs, and then continue to try to balkanize their countries and support separatist movements. And they've drawn red lines. Russia has said Ukraine and Belarus are a red line. China has said that Taiwan and Hong Kong are red lines, and they're now acting. And then the US acts as though these countries are now imperialist, although they're just defending, in the case of China in particular, it's defending two regions that are part of China, Hong Kong and Taiwan. The US supposedly recognizes the one China policy. When Nixon signed the famous historic agreements with China in the 1970s, the US, there were 3 different diplomatic agreements that China often quotes, that often cites, that the US signed with China. And those agreements recognize the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China. So the US says one thing and does the other. The US makes an agreement with Iran and then breaks the agreement. As Russia says, which is an objective fact, the United States is agreement incapable. It cannot make an agreement with any country in the world. And if it makes an agreement with you, it's still going to continue plotting coups. It's still going to continue trying to destabilize your country. And at the end of the day, if the agreement is no longer convenient, it's going to leave the agreement. So these countries have been forced to take a more aggressive posture. And ironically, in the case of Russia, it's not out of any ideological views other than nationalism. I mean, Putin is certainly not a socialist, but in the case of China, ironically, it has strengthened the left wing of the Communist Party of China, because for many years, there was a significant wing of the Communist Party of China that was going down the capitalist road, saying that we want positive relations with Western imperialism. We want to integrate with Western capital. And ironically, the refusal of US imperialism to tolerate any other significant geopolitical competitor strengthened Russian nationalism and strengthened the left wing of the Communist Party of China, and encouraged Eurasian integration of China and Russia and Iran, and now Kazakhstan and these other countries, which are not only integrating economically, but politically and even militarily, to the point where Russia has said publicly that it is creating high-tech military weaponry with China. So for me, I mean, it just shows that US imperialism has, as Lenin famously said, the capitalists will sell you the nooses we used to hang them. And US imperialism has dug its own grave.